in order for me to be financially successful, topic number one is learning how money works. And the big problem I have is that people don't know how money works.
Yeah.
They don't know how money works in the US, they don't know how money works in Mexico, and they don't know how money works in Argentina.
Yeah.
The nuance and the difference between those three is that it's okay in North America to not really understand how money works because it doesn't inflate that fast. You have the reserve currency. You can kind of plan around it and still have your plans go according to how you drew them based on inflation being in a particular level and no black swan events.
Yeah.
That is not the same in Latin America. Okay, in Latin America, you are sending people literally to the butcher. You're telling them, oh, behave and act and read the same books as the Americans, but your money doesn't work the same way. Your money inflates at 10x the same speed, but they're teaching them the same lessons. Save in the fiat currency, put it in a little savings account, pay attention. No, they don't even talk about inflation or how money works. They don't want you to think about it. A Venezuelan doctor, the problem is in Latin America is that if you're not an inflation specialist, you cannot be a financially successful doctor. You cannot be a financially successful chef. You cannot be a financially successful anything. You have to be an economist and then a doctor and then a this. And so you're almost pre-requiring these people to have a doctorate degree level of understanding in economics just so they can have the basic information to be able to do the right thing when they get paid.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are here today with Mauricio Di Bartolomeo. Please correct me if I pronounced that wrong, Mauricio.
That was pretty good.
Okay, little gringo-ish, but not too bad. Mauricio, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. I've been looking to speak with you since I heard you speak a while back about some of the early days of, I think, when you or people you knew were mining Bitcoin in Venezuela. But before I get into that, if you could introduce yourself to the audience. You can get into a little bit of how you found Bitcoin now, or just kind of give a general overview of what you do in the Bitcoin space currently, and then we could dive a little deeper after that.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So my name is Mauricio Di Bartolomeo. As you mentioned, I have been in the Bitcoin space since sometime in 2015 is when I would say I officially got in. Ledn as a firm is now 5 years old. So we've been at this since 2018 issuing Bitcoin-backed loans, but we'll get into that in a second. I found Bitcoin in Venezuela, or my family rather found it before I did, because they were in Venezuela experiencing hyperinflation and looking for opportunities businesses that could still be done in the sort of authoritarian hyperinflationary environment that we were in. And by fate, I don't really know what the right reason is, but my youngest brother decides to start mining Bitcoin back in summer of 2015.
Okay.
And my parents supported him in the early days. I can kind of go through the story because it's a bit funny, but he finds Bitcoin in this environment and he just starts thriving in the context where everyone else is literally looking where to migrate to and fire selling all of their assets. My brother is out there looking for places to rent to expand his operations. And as I witnessed what Bitcoin did to help people in Venezuela experiencing hyperinflation and how they were able to protect their savings through both buying Bitcoin and mining Bitcoin. In that moment, and really it all happened in December 2015 when I went back to see how his facilities had been progressing. And when I saw how he was thriving and how others were thriving, it was lights out for me. I basically, it was like I felt the calling. I was like, this is what I need to do. I need to help this project. And at first it started with mining myself. That's how I learned to get into it, or how I got into it. Then I started helping other people learn how to mine. And through that process of wanting to grow our mines, but never wanting to sell our Bitcoin, and nobody giving us a loan with Bitcoin as collateral, that was really the genesis of Ledn, which we started the firm in 2018. And since then, it's grown and expanded into several other services. But our flagship product continues to be helping people not to sell their Bitcoin if they need cash. So you come to Ledn, you place your Bitcoin as collateral, you get a dollar loan, you repay the loan, you get your Bitcoin back. That's effectively our flagship product, but we can get into that in more later down. So I'll park it for now.
No, I appreciate the overview. I think it'll help the audience a little bit if they're not familiar. So thank you. I'd like to rewind back to what the situation was like in Venezuela in 2015. To give some context to the audience, I was living in Venezuela in 2010 into 2011. I can give some numbers. I think the legal exchange rate for US dollars to the national currency of Venezuela, which is bolivares, was maybe about $1 to get about 4.5 bolivares. And in the black market at that time, I was getting anywhere from about 9 to 11 bolivares. So the black market, the rate was more than double. By 2015, I would say, from what I understood, I had family members still living there, I think as late as 2016, 17. That seemed like the peak of the crisis. So once 2015 came around, if you don't mind providing, what would $1 get you in Venezuela by then, Mauricio?
Yeah, so I have to double check because the numbers moved so fast that it's hard to keep tabs on exactly what the rate was at a particular point. But I believe here I can look it up. Hold on, paralelo Venezuela to 186 bolivares per dollar was the rate. So roughly 4x from when you left. And to paint a picture, why these different rates come into being, like what makes these rates exist, is that when a government starts enacting policies that perhaps a large side of the population doesn't agree with, what starts happening is, depending on what the side of the population does, which is generally, if they don't trust what you're doing, is they start selling their assets and their local currency and buying any other currency or any other asset that is not tied to your country. So in Venezuela, that would be you're selling bolivares to buy dollars. You're selling your property to get bolivares to buy dollars, and potentially buy that similar property in another place in the world, largely Miami, which was the big capital destination for a lot of Venezuelans that migrated. But when people start doing this, the official exchange rate goes to the gutter, right? Like your bolivar goes from needing 2 bolivares to buy a dollar, it goes to needing 4 and 5 and 6 bolivares to buy that same dollar. And the exchange rate of your local currency vis-a-vis the dollar is in many ways a government's report card. The better a government is doing, the less of your local units you need to buy a dollar. The worse your government is doing, the more and more and more units you'll need to buy a dollar. And that is simply a reflection of the deficits that the government has to run, which then imply how much money the government has to print. So in a government like in a country like Venezuela, there were two things happening. There was oil revenues were increasing. So in fact, the country's deficit was not effectively growing, but it was because it was all subsidized by the shoot up of oil prices that were making up for the inefficiencies of the Chavez government. So if you back out the increase in the oil revenue and you normalize that to what it would be in a normal condition, and you then overlay that on the government's plans, you get these massive deficits. And so even though why the Venezuelan actual deficit wasn't soaring because of the increase in oil prices, people knew that as soon as oil prices went back to normal, this was going to create a horrible situation in Venezuela. And that basically was why people didn't really care too much about where oil prices were going. They knew where Venezuela was going, and they knew where oil prices were going to come back to eventually. So they kind of extrapolate the two things, and they still choose to exit. So as more people are exiting, the Venezuelan bolivar gets weaker and weaker, and a government has a very hard time telling the rest of the world why oil prices, which are their main sources of revenue, are increasing, yet their currency is going through the gutter. That really means that people there really don't trust what you're doing. Like really, really don't trust what you're doing. And that sends a wrong signal. So what the government does is says, you know what? The people that are selling their bolivares for these dollars, they are doing this to hurt our image to the world. And they are not doing this for true economic reasons. They're really only doing this to make us look bad. And so for that reason, we're going to not allow the US dollar to trade freely anymore. We're going to be the only sellers of the dollars, and we set the price. And the price is not 8 like they are telling you, is 2. And we will sell you dollars at 2. And so, of course, people will be like, great, let me line right up and get all those dollars at 2. And then the government says, whoa, we cannot sell you all of the dollars at 2. We can only sell you this amount of dollars at 2. So then you get these rations, or I'm trying to find the right word, but you get an allocation.
Rations.
A ration, yeah. You get a ration of dollars that you can buy each year for any reason. So any natural person can purchase up to $3,000 for buying online things and traveling, right? And so you can buy that at the government rate, which is artificial and completely fake. But then you can take the dollars that you buy at that government rate, say 2 bolivares to a dollar, you get your dollar and you turn right around and you sell it to someone else for 6 or 8, because that's what people pay to get a dollar, because nobody can get them at the rate the government says. So I actually have a bit of a personal qualm with this concept of dubbing the government exchange rate the rate, and then the real market rate, people dub it the black market. It's not the black market. That is the market. The black market is the government rate, because that only goes to their buddies and cronies. So, and it's not representative of what the value of the currency is. It's what they think it is. And they are not the market. The market is what you get or you can sell to at any other person at any given time. So the reason these rates come into existence is because the government is trying to protect its image, and it's then trying to choke access off to dollars for people in their own economies. This makes it even worse, because as dollars become more scarce, people get more desperate and they're willing to bid them up higher and higher and higher. And so it creates this vicious cycle that really plays against people. And the more sinister part of all of that is that when those things get enacted, it doesn't have the effect the government thinks it's going to have. The government thinks this is going to prevent like wealthy people, owners of factories, owners of assets, to not have to sell their dollars and to not be able to hedge their wealth. And this is not the case. These people that are in these conditions have relationships at all the local banks. They have accounts at all of the main international banks, and they are able to use the market, the alternate market or the real market, to effectively sell their property, buy dollars at whatever rate it is they need to, and then send those dollars out, because that's what they're going to do anyway. So what it ends up doing is that it creates a even faster incentive for you, the factory owner, to close your factory, because you know you're not going to be able to get the dollars you need to keep producing the things you produce.
Right.
And so you're going to have an incentive to shut it all down and just fire people and then sell the factory, take your money abroad, start over. So what that does is it creates more unemployment, and it hurts the people in the lowest stratus of society. So that's what's happening in Argentina right now. If you look at Argentina, you'll say Google exchange rate in Argentina, you're going to find 7 or 8 exchange rates, and it's the same movie playing out. The movie is very, very similar whenever it plays.
I think it's hard for people to imagine what this like if they weren't there. And I didn't see it when it got very, very bad, but I did see desperation starting to build in 2011. I'm curious as to how this feels to you. There's a lot of people in Canada and the US, especially in the Bitcoin community, kind of yelling about inflation, hyperinflation. Is it a little bit frustrating given that your family sort of experienced it? What we're going through is inconvenient, to say the least. And I'm not downplaying it, because I think it's very dangerous. I think fiat in general can become a very dangerous thing. Much better to have money tied to commodities, gold, whatever it is. What are your feelings, kind of given what your family's been through versus what sometimes you hear people say in developed countries? It's a little bit of a different experience, I would imagine.
Totally. And I don't fault anyone to feel a particular way if they haven't lived through it. It just comes across in the view, right? And what I try to do is provide some color or some context on the experience that we lived through. So the way I like to explain the two things is, I believe inflation and hyperinflation are two things that are separate and distinct.
Mm.
Inflation as an economic concept is just mathematics. Okay, if you have an asset base that say there's 10 assets and they are all the same, and you have that 1,000 units of money, equilibrium will be found at the 10 equal assets being worth 100 units of money each, right? If then you have some sort of economic shock or event and you inject another 1,000 units of money into the economy, prices will find equilibrium at 200 units of money per each equal asset. So it just comes back to the same equilibrium. That is inflation. It's a mathematical process whereby a fixed asset supply gets repriced on a newly dynamic money supply. So the money supply is dynamic, asset base is largely fixed. So as the money supply increases, the price of the assets vary accordingly. That's inflation. That's what we're seeing today.
Yep.
It's not surprising that the US government or the Canadian government expanded their balance sheets to the tune of 30 to 40% over COVID. And now, lo and behold, property prices are 30 to 40% higher. Oh my God, who could have seen that coming? Like it's pretty mathematic.
Yeah.
Then hyperinflation is different, because hyperinflation means you're injecting, let's use the same example, you're injecting the same 1,000 units of money into the system, but there's no want to make sure I explain this accordingly. What happens when you are in a hyperinflationary environment is not that people adapt the price of their assets relative to your new money supply. Many times what ends up happening is people lose faith in your ability as a government to keep the country on its rails. So just because basically they believe that you can print infinity amounts and that you are going to print infinity amounts, and they behave accordingly. And what that means is that it's not just me looking back at what the expansion of the money supply said, and okay, it was 30%, therefore my assets I'm going to charge 30% more for, right? That's mathematics. In hyperinflation, they print these 1,000 units of money, and then you're looking at that saying, they're going to print this thing again. So I'm not going to reprice my asset at 30%. I'm going to anticipate they're going to do that again. I'm going to reprice my asset 60% higher. And then they do that again, and before your asset sells, you're like, you know what? They're probably going to do this again. I'm going to just reprice this thing to 90% more. And so you basically start running ahead of what the government is going to do. You lose complete faith in their promise not to print. So you assume that the printers is going to keep going on and on and on until infinity, and you act accordingly. What does that mean? You get rid of all your local currency. You try to get rid of as many local assets as you can, and then buy assets somewhere else. And so what ends up happening in hyperinflation is that a government increases the money supply by 2, and prices go up by 6, because people think that 2 was just the beginning. But even more importantly, when banks hit hyperinflation, typically central banks stop reporting money supply so that you are not able to manage accordingly. Then again, that has the opposite effect. That makes you assume the worst.
Yep.
And so you're just going to trade or invest accordingly. And that is what I think is a big distinction between the two. I believe Venezuela is in hyperinflation. I believe Cuba is in hyperinflation. North Korea is in hyperinflation. Iran, Yemen, you name the failed countries. And look, and there you will find a strong correlation between hyperinflation and authoritarian dictatorships. Most often than not, for example, in Argentina, I think it's on the verge of hyperinflation pending this coming election. If this coming election does not go the way of democracy, I think you're going to see a very nasty picture in Argentina. But again, if the pendulum is able to swing back into fiscal responsibility, then I think you see Argentina kind of come back around. But again, it's teetering on the edge.
Yeah. These talking about Latin American countries, the financial situations in them, it's a very complex topic because there's a long history for why these countries are in the situation that they're in. So there's a little part of me, please don't be angry with me, that sort of gets why authoritarian leaders become popular. People are often desperate. They're not in a great situation. International organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, make leaders impose austerity upon people in a very unfair manner. So before we get into something like Bitcoin, which can help on an individual level, what do you really think is a way forward in the traditional sense of the word? Is it just that these companies have to sort of be inviting to entrepreneurs, to people, to essentially welcome free markets so that some sort of new equilibrium, some sort of value can be found, or does that even feel like a lost cause at this point?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So what is it that keeps countries like Venezuela and Argentina and others on this treadmill of not being able to come out of our trap of debt, right? And it's a combination of things. I don't think I have a silver bullet answer to how this gets solved. Broadly speaking, I think there's a large. So I'll try to put it to you this way. In order to be successful, and this is how I kind of drew my own education when I was growing up. Okay, when I was growing up, my dad was an entrepreneur, and he was always talking to his friends, and I would always hear him talk about his business dealings and what he was going to try next, and pay this and pay that, and invest here and invest that. And so I knew he was an entrepreneur, and I wanted to do the same, and I wanted to be financially successful. And I remember from very early on, I think I must have been like 9 or 10 years old, when I was sitting at the dinner table and my dad was asking or talking to his buddies about payments in the millions. And I was like, Dad, I want to buy this toy that's like a couple thousand bolivares. And he was like, no, we can't do that right now. And I'm like, well, but you're just talking about millions. It's like, yeah, but that's a business. That's very different. And so then I said to myself, okay, well, you know what? In order for me to be financially successful, topic number one is learning how money works. And the big problem I have is that people don't know how money works.
Yeah.
They don't know how money works in the US, they don't know how money works in Mexico, and they don't know how money works in Argentina.
Yeah.
The nuance and the difference between those three is that it's okay in North America to not really understand how money works because it doesn't inflate that fast. You have the reserve currency. You can kind of plan around it and still have your plans go according to how you drew them based on inflation being in a particular level and no black swan events.
Yeah.
That is not the same in Latin America. Okay, in Latin America, you are sending people literally to the butcher. You're telling them, oh, behave and act and read the same books as the Americans, but your money doesn't work the same way. Your money inflates at 10x the same speed, but they're teaching them the same lessons. Save in the fiat currency, put it in a little savings account, pay attention. No, they don't even talk about inflation or how money works. They don't want you to think about it. A Venezuelan doctor, the problem is in Latin America is that if you're not an inflation specialist, you cannot be a financially successful doctor. You cannot be a financially successful chef. You cannot be a financially successful anything. You have to be an economist and then a doctor and then a this. And so you're almost pre-requiring these people to have a doctorate degree level of understanding in economics just so they can have the basic information to be able to do the right thing when they get paid.
Yep.
Because what ends up happening is a doctor gets paid. If they don't get rid of those bolivares, invest them in dollars, or hedge themselves accordingly, they're going to have those bolivares sitting in their bank account until payroll hits. When payroll hits, the currency is worth 30% less. Mm-hmm. People are asking them for raises. They don't have the money to top up the raises. The business fails. So the problem is that in places like Europe and the United States, you can get by not really understanding how money works because it doesn't play against you in the same way that it plays against people all over the world. And so we're trying to prescribe a solution of hard work, save money away. It's not going to work until they get why their money is never enough to buy that house. And so I think, and I know this is beating a dead horse, but to me, this all goes back to education. Yeah. And beating down propaganda, because governments control the media. I speak for Venezuela. Were you there with the medio malo with the first currency reconversion? I think that was 2014.
Yeah, I think that was about 2 or 3 years after I left. Yes.
So when a government comes in, the first thing they do in the case of Venezuela, is they take control of the media and they start using the mainstream media narrative to say that we are anti-patriotic for telling you that your currency is going to inflate away, or
Mm,
we are anti-patriotic for telling some members of society to perhaps hedge away out of the bolivar. May not be in their best interest to save in bolivares. They're saying, "Oh my God, you're telling our people to sell our own national currency. You are an anti-patriot." And these guys are just cronies and crooks. And inflation is not generated by us printing money. It's generated by these filthy corporations that demand higher profits and they jack up the prices. And then the corporations go back and they say, "We're only jacking up the prices because you can't let us buy dollars, and we need more bolivares to buy the dollars." And they will go back and say, "No, it's because you want to keep making your profits. If you cut down your 15% profit, you could make the good of the price cost the same." And that is a very hard narrative to defeat at a mainstream media level, because the government is always going to have the biggest megaphone, and their megaphone is going to say what is in their best interest. So I think that largely is the main issue. It's not so much even like the amount of social programs or things that people have been
yeah.
accustomed to. It's this idea that you are deliberately being held back from understanding how money works,
Yep.
and money is built to be deliberately complex, such that you stop your quest at some point. And that is especially true in North America.
Yep.
Like, so I'll take a pause there.
I appreciate that. And there's two things that came to mind. One, in North America, most people sort of, if you can afford a house, you're sort of automatically hedging because real estate tends to go up, which was not the case in Venezuela. As you just said, people were actually getting out of their houses. So the normal hedge, the normal hard asset, quote unquote, that we have in North America for some people who can afford a house is their house, whereas that's not the case in Venezuela. So that advantage is not there if you are someone in Venezuela who can afford property. The other side of it, to add to what you just said, not only is money complex, but then financial markets are complex, and most people give up. I started writing a newsletter about Bitcoin and financial markets after years of studying them on my own, and most people just look at me like, "Doesn't your brain hurt? Like, why are you looking into all of this?" And I think that the reason I started looking into it is because often when we talk about money and politics, markets, whatever it is, we talk about the redistribution of money, but we don't talk about the nature of money. And those are two very different things. I'm not against the redistribution of money. I think social programs have value and all of those things. But the problem then is you sort of do away with your middle class when you're devaluing the currency and you're sort of saying, well, we need more taxes for social programs. And it sort of crushes people because wealthy people, especially where I live in New York, there's plenty of people I know who don't spend. If they have a lot of money, they don't spend 185 days in New York so that they don't have to pay New York taxes. They can have a residence here. So what happens is that you're creating these loopholes for the uber wealthy to not pay their part. So it's easier just to not debase the currency, but that's a very difficult political thing to do. Most politicians, especially when we're in the situation we're in, are just going to opt to debase the currency because most people can only think about money in nominal terms. I have $100, I have $200. They don't think about the real value of it because it's very difficult to do that, especially when CPI and other metrics are kind of juked. They're constantly changing. We constantly change the inputs. So it's very complicated to think about money in this regard. I want to go back a little bit to your brother in 2015. So he finds Bitcoin and he starts mining it. He's mining it on what, a laptop? Did he get an ASIC at that point? Or well,
No.
yeah.
So the way it happened is he got talking to a buddy of his who was in Houston, Texas, and this guy in Houston had bought his first ASICs from Bitmain. I think it was S5s or
Okay.
S7s. I can't remember. I think it was the first of the S7s or the last of the S5s. It was around that time. And I think the first one were S5s and the second ones were S7s, if I get it correctly. But either way, he's talking to his friend. His friend says, "You need to get into this Bitcoin thing. I can't do too much of it here in Houston because power prices are very high. Electricity prices are too high. But you need to get into this because down there, it's heavily subsidized."
Yep.
So he sends my brother the link. My brother starts reading up on it. He goes back to his buddy. He's like, "Hey, let's do it. Like, help me out. How did you buy it? How was your experience?" My friend's buddy goes dark. my brother's friend goes dark because I guess he got busy. So my brother didn't really know what the process was like to buy something from Bitmain, or who Bitmain was, or what Bitcoin was. And my dad sends me the white paper, and he says, your brother is pretty adamant in doing this. He's given us a bit of an ultimatum. He's going to leave the house if we don't support
Okay.
this venture. So would you mind looking at this thing and tell me what you think? So that was my first exposure to the Bitcoin white paper. I read it, and my lens when I was reading that is, what are the miners here? What role do they play? Can they make some money? And when I read it, my takeaway was, miners are basically the bouncers of the Bitcoin network. They are the guys that protect the network, reject or organize transactions and submit them to the nodes for approval. And if a transaction, the miner that is the strongest and can provide the answers the fastest, that it's not the best analogy, but that was my understanding
That's
at the
good.
time.
Yeah, that's good.
And so, in my view, miners had two inputs, or three: the hardware, internet, and electricity.
Yep.
And they had one output, Bitcoin.
Yep.
So out of the three outputs, internet and electricity were heavily subsidized in Venezuela, and there was only one person making ASICs. So the price was pretty fair, assuming they would give the same price to everyone else. The inputs were very favorable for Venezuela, and the output could be sold for dollars, which was not true for any other output or any other Venezuelan factory. So I was like, okay, subsidized inputs, global output, checks out. So I said, on the premise of that, I think this is a good idea. So they greenlight the purchase, and my brother buys the ASICs, and I forgot about it for the summer. And we kind of talked about it here and there, but I didn't really think about it much again until I went back down for Christmas. So when I go back down for Christmas, I go visit my brother in his facility, in his little dusty room. And there were, I believe the first purchase was for 5 ASICs, the first sort of purchase they made. And when I went to the facility, I believe there were 10 or 15 of them, like a lot more. And so that immediately, I'm like, oh boy, what's going on here? So I didn't confront my brother immediately. I went to my dad and I said, Dad, why'd you give him more money? We had agreed that it was a small test. What happened? And my dad's response was, oh, I forgot to tell you, he paid me back the loan. Those are his computers. So I'm like, I go to my brother, very skeptical, and I'm like, Mario, how did you actually do this? What are you really doing? And he says, I'm mining Bitcoin. Let me show you. And I said, fine, send me 2 million bolivares, which I can't remember at the time, was not that much. It was a couple $100. Send me 2 million bolivares to my Banesco account. Turn that little Bitcoin thing of yours into bolivares.
Yeah.
And show me you can do this at the real rate, right? At the actual market rate, the black market, entre comillas. Not black, it's the market. But so my brother sends the Bitcoin to this exchange called Sur Bitcoin, which was working at the time. It was they, of course, like anything that works in Venezuela, the founders were prosecuted. But that was later on. So my brother sends the Bitcoin to Sur Bitcoin, sells the Bitcoin for bolivares and Sur Bitcoin at the rate as if you back into what a Bitcoin costs versus dollar cost in bolivares, and you get the corresponding amount of bolivares. He sold it at the correct rate.
Okay.
And then the bolivars get withdrawn to my Banesco account, and it hits within an hour of him telling me he was going to do it. When those bolivares hit my bank account, that was the lights out moment for me, because I was able to see how a person could get an asset, this Bitcoin asset that is now fully virtual, fully digital, without needing permission from anyone. They send that Bitcoin into an exchange where it gets traded to the currency they want. That currency hits your bank account without the trials and tribulations of having to have a Wells Fargo account or a Bank of America account and a Banesco account and a Banco Venezuela account, because that's what you need to operate in the alternative market or the black market. And that was very prohibitive for most people in society. But when I saw this, I said to myself, oh my God, now people in Venezuela can hedge away from bolivares without needing to ask for the central bank's permission, without needing to go through the US dollar necessarily directly. This is a game changer. And that's everybody. In the past, it was only the wealthy people who had bank accounts everywhere that were able to hedge at their disposal. Capital control, no capital control, it never impacts the wealthy. Same, new tax structures never impacts the wealthy. Tax structures are issued with a year advance on purpose so that all their buddies can restructure their new entities across the world so that they don't pay enough taxes, right? And perfect example of this is Warren Buffett. Like, he famously pays 10 to 15% tax. He's
Right.
the richest man in the planet.
Yeah.
But me or you, who are salaried employees, can get taken up to 50% off the top. Just you never even see it. Just hits your bank account X 50. And so tax schemes, capital controls, none of the stuff impacts the wealthy. It's a theater. The government loves to sell it as, look at us, now we're going after the big corporations.
Yeah.
Big corporations are set up in Ireland, my man.
Yeah.
They're not.
That's right.
They're running two full bodies ahead of you, the government, right? And so who this really impacts is the people that cannot afford to understand finance. And in some ways, I try to see this, and I don't mean to take this down a dark path, but I do see this as our modern society is equivalent of survival of the fittest. And we've been sold this idea that the hardest workers survive. I've seen a lot of hard workers sink into poverty.
Right.
And I've seen a lot of not hard workers, but seemingly astute people that understand how to move the levers and what the levers impact, just make absolutely outrageous amounts of cash.
Yep.
And so the lesson that drew to me was, it almost doesn't matter how hard you work if you're not doing the right things with the money after you get paid. And so we need to educate people on how money works, but educating people on that means being very candid that the government has an endless supply of money they can print. Yep. And I think people would get very uneasy if you said that to them right now, even though it's the truth. I'm having conversations with people in Canada, a G7 nation,
right,
where people still think that the Canadian dollar is backed by gold, even though that Canada is only one of the few countries in G7 that has no gold reserves. Zero. Yep. Canadians, some still think the Canadian dollar is backed by something.
Yeah.
And so, again, they can afford to because they're Canadian. Americans can afford to not understand because they're American. Yep. Europeans can afford to because they got the euro. No one else has that luxury.
Yep. The way that I'll shift a little to Bitcoin now. The way that I think about it, I spent some time in Venezuela. Then I had moved to Venezuela from spending time in rural Ghana. So I was in rural Africa before moving to. I lived in a barrio in Barquisimeto, and I was teaching at Fe Alegria in the Catholic school there. And yeah, so I was very much living with some of the poorest people in the country. I don't mean to say that, but people of the lowest socioeconomic status. I don't know the correct way to say that, but what I learned from both, rural Ghanaians and inner city Venezuelans was, these are actually some of the most, hardworking, entrepreneurial, sharp, focused people. And when I think about an asset now like Bitcoin, like what happens if you pay these people in the most pristine collateral the world has ever seen? Or what happens if these people can now save in something like that? I'll get to that in just a moment, because I don't think, from what I understand, Venezuela is not quite there for a few different reasons. But the idea there is, I think we all grow up. I mean, I grew up with it. My father went to college, and he still sort of talked about that sort of blue collar. You work hard, you save your dollars, all of this stuff. Because again, I think it's just too complex to think outside of that. But I think it's also a certain feeling of, well, I'm not going to go against my country. Why would I, why would I save in anything but my country's currency? I believe in my country. I love my country. And these are very, very emotional topics. So it's very difficult to tackle these things without seeming like you're just this like renegade, libertarian who just, and so you have to really figure out a very interesting sort of angle to try to explain these things to people. And I joke, I love my mom, and I explained Bitcoin to her years ago, and she got it, and she's down with it. She gets it. But she said something to me, jokingly, just like, doesn't your brain hurt? Like, why do you think about this stuff so much? And I think what happens is that for me, what brought me to it was student loan debt. I couldn't get out of it. I had 7 jobs at one point, and I couldn't get past paying the interest on the debt that I owed every month. Just the interest on the debt, which is like 5-6% in America. And to get a master's degree in America, it's almost impossible to do it for less than 60 to 100 grand. So we're put in this state, and I know this might sound dramatic, of basically indentured servitude. And I'm smart enough to know that it shouldn't be this way. But I wasn't smart enough in 2017, 18, when I first learned about Bitcoin, to know why things were the way that they were. And so I think that what starts to happen is that when you're sort of insulated from these lessons, if you're sort of living, like you said, in the United States or Canada, and you don't really understand the nature of money, you sort of have to get to a point where you get to enough pain where you start having to study it. Pain is an amazing teacher. And I don't think a lot of people in the US and Canada have that as a teacher because they don't necessarily have to. I think it saddens me. We still have people just hoping for Biden's student loan forgiveness and this forgiveness or that. It's likely not going to happen. And I think that my encouragement for people is just try to take matters into your own hands as much as possible to make better economical decisions. I'm not saying you have to invest in Bitcoin or something like that, but to just think a little bit more like, is the system really helping me, and is it not? And now there's always trade-offs. In some ways it might be, in some ways it might not be, but to think a little bit more about that, I think, is really important. But I do want to bounce over to, does Venezuela need Bitcoin right now? And there was a special that kind of replays in my mind. A few years back, Peter McCormick went to, I think it was, I forget which, Cucuta. Cucuta is the city in Colombia, right? Right on the border of Venezuela. I think he went down there and he said, look, I wanted to come back and say Bitcoin's going to save the day in Venezuela, but realistically, people there need US dollars right now. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Why is Bitcoin not maybe the entire answer, or maybe not the day-to-day answer for most Venezuelans right now, if you agree with that?
I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Okay.
I think that what people need is a vehicle to protect themselves from the irresponsibility of a local currency management, right? Like, for a Venezuelan person, having Bitcoin or having a dollar or having a euro is almost indifferent. Or having gold that can be easily traded in and out of. It's almost indifferent.
Okay.
Your main goal here is to have not bolivares, right? So whatever it is that you can hold that can maintain its price along with inflation. And this was true during the hyperinflationary periods as well, because other things get monetized. When your money stops working as money, other things get monetized. Yeah. So in Venezuela, it was cars, because cars could get bought and sold and you could reprice them, and there was no limit to how expensive a price of a car could be. So you would buy a car for 10,000 bolivares, and then the currency would get devalued and it would be worth less, so you could price the car for 20,000 bolivares, and no regulator or nobody could bat an eye, because there's no regulation on what the price of a used car can be, right? And so, but there is regulations on how expensive you can sell a dollar, or if and when you can sell a dollar. But those restrictions don't exist in the day-to-day economy. You would have to choke the whole thing, right? And at first, people started monetizing vehicles, right? Then, if you couldn't afford cars, you would monetize a set of tires, because tires were also non-perishable and you could reprice them. And then, if you couldn't afford tires, you could do it with kilos of sugar. And if you couldn't do that, then you do cans of tuna. And so on and so forth. Plastic chairs were used as barter items. So, there were times where I would trade whole chickens for sugar, or tires for tuna. Like, that was a commonplace thing, because it was easier to reprice a non-perishable than to have dollars and transact in dollars in an environment that they're trying to prevent you not to do that, right? Like, if you get caught trying to sell a dollar, you can get in a lot of trouble. No one bats an eye if you get caught trying to sell some eggs, right? Like, and so people just start using other things as money, right? And everything becomes monetized, right? So if a person in Venezuela, and the great example is when Venezuela had to bend the knee to the dollar, when Maduro basically was unable, because what was happening is for the government, it starts hitting your image when you say to people, nobody should be able to trade in dollars. But then you go and pay to a store, and the store says, I only take dollars. And then you go try to buy something else. It's like, yeah, we'll only be able to do this in dollars. And sorry. And you're like, wait, but the government says, and you're like, yeah, no, we if we listen to what the government says, we wouldn't be here. So this is how it is. And so if you're the government saying nobody can do this, but then on the economy, like everybody is actually doing it because they don't believe or care about your ability to enforce something that makes absolutely no sense, then the government is eventually going to have to bend the knee and say, okay, well, if we don't want to look like no one's respecting us, let's just say that people can use it, and that'll be that. And Maduro removed a lot of the restrictions on the dollar, and the country's by and large dollarized today. Today, you use bolivares for two things: paying Venezuelan taxes, if you so choose to or want to. And the second one is, if you're going to buy something and it costs $10.53, and you don't have 53 cents on you, you will do $10 and this many bolivares.
Wow.
To hit to the cents, because it moves so fast that you couldn't even hit the $10 in bolivares. It would be too many bills, right? So it's used as literal change, coins, and tax bucks, right? Like that's the extent to which the bolivar is used today. And why do I say that the dollar is in many ways today more useful than a Bitcoin to Venezuelans? It's hard to understand how money works. It's hard to understand how the bolivar works. It's hard to understand how the dollar works. If you don't understand those two things, you will not understand Bitcoin.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard for you to go from not understanding money to valuing Bitcoin for what it is. Mm-hmm. So it's almost too many steps removed.
Yep.
And it might work for them, but they won't understand why it worked for them. So what people know and trust is the US dollar.
Yeah.
And you can say a lot of things about the government. If you're an American person, you may say, but the dollar also inflates, and oh my God, and how can they trust the Fed? And these guys are also out.
Yeah.
If you saw our Fed, you would think your Fed is the smartest dude in the room, the smartest person in the room. You would throw money at your Fed if you saw our Fed. Just throw it all at him. And so in many ways, and this is why I was such a big proponent of stablecoins when they came out. Mm-hmm. And it got me into some debates with some Bitcoiners, because they're like, how are you going to put people on a wrap dollar? I'm like, this is what helps them. This is what they want. They ask anyone around the world. I bet you, I ask you, go on Alibaba right now. Find a supplier in Turkey. Find a supplier in Nigeria. Find a supplier in the UAE. And ask all three of them how they want to get paid. What is your preferred method of payment? And all of them are either going to say dollars or a stablecoin.
Yeah.
And why? Because your inputs are priced in dollars. Why? Yes. Because some of your debt might be priced in dollars. Why? Because your rent might be priced in dollars. And so it is a tool that helps people. What most people want is to prevent themselves from inflation. This whole concept that Bitcoin provides, which is it will hold your value even under US dollar inflation, that's like, economics 102, right? Like if economics 101 is get out of your currency to the dollar, getting out of the dollar to Bitcoin is like economics 102. It's like a second lesson, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I think I don't really think of myself as like an uber crypto proponent, quote unquote, but I do understand the value of stable coins and, the fact that it's cheaper to send them on different chains like Tron and stuff like that. Does it make me want to go out and buy a bunch of Tron? No, not necessarily. But for the sake of it being a tool, sure, I get it. No problem. And I think also the other thing, and you might, I think the other side of it, sometimes with stable coins, they can even just be settled off chain. So sometimes those, the transactions can actually be settled off chain. Not that that's the best way to do it, but I look at it like it's not. I get people's philosophical argument with like, no, just Bitcoin only. I get that. And in terms of like what Bitcoin is, there's only one. There's nothing close. Ethereum's not, that's it. But different things, you don't even have to think of it like crypto per se. You could just think of it like Venmo, another version of Venmo, or something like an international version of Venmo, like something like that. I think it's framed the wrong way. So, and I think that, understanding it that way, I think to bring up Peter McCormack again, he just went down to Argentina and he posted something on Twitter saying, people actually do like to use Matic or Ethereum to send stable coins. And there's a lot of Bitcoiners, no, they should. It's like, guys, you don't live there. You don't know what this is like. Like, people will do what they feel is in their best interest, regardless of the theoretical underpinnings of the asset or something like that. So we need to sort of understand that. Sure, can we do some education that maybe saving in Bitcoin is good for the long term? I mean, even in Venezuela, I think in June, Bitcoin hit its highest price ever when priced in bolivares. No, it actually hit an all-time high in bolivares. But most people aren't thinking about all-time highs in a currency. They're just thinking about day-to-day stuff. And also, the problem with something like Bitcoin is how new it is. And this almost sounds like an anti-Bitcoin podcast. It's very much a Bitcoin podcast. Don't get me wrong, but the reality is that it takes a long time for something to become the unit of account, to become the denominator, which is what the dollar is for about 80% of the world's debts. That's not going to change tomorrow. It might change one day, maybe however many years from now, and Bitcoin is fully monetized. It might not. So for the time being, to most people, Bitcoin is one, very new, still very speculative. It has a lot of these other, has a lot of attributes that most people are not super comfortable with yet. And the fact that in a lot of developed countries, there isn't even really clear regulation around it, it's not going to be something that a lot of people gravitate towards right away. Over time, I think it will gain value and people will become educated. It will seem less taboo, less whatever. And it just naturally, as the monetization process happens, I think it'll just be, I don't think you're going to see the same sort of gains every cycle. It's not going to go up 1,000%. It's becoming already more stable than it was, even 5, 6, 7 years ago. So, yeah, it's an interesting tool, but I think that in Venezuela, especially having some family still there, I have not once heard my family say we're sending Bitcoin down to them. Or I could see using it as a network. You could send Bitcoin, then have them change it back into bolivares or something like that, which is also the funny thing where, Bitcoin, most people think about it as the asset. The permissionless network is a very cool thing, but I think the other networks, like you said, with stablecoins are permissionless enough for people to just use those to transact in stablecoins. So that actually brings me to an interesting place. So Ledn brings me to another question, I should say. Ledn works with, you have people can deposit their Bitcoin with you in efforts to get a loan in fiat. But you also offer a yield on stable coins, and those stable coins are not based on the Bitcoin blockchain. So do you get pushback from the Bitcoin community because you do offer a product outside of the realm of Bitcoin? And if so, how do you deal with that?
So it was a very interesting exercise to announce stablecoin support as a Bitcoin company. I remember the first show I did that was with Marty Bent, Tales from the Crypt, which was a really interesting conversation, because the way I explained it, and it was the reality, is we started this is how it all started. We were issuing loans in dollars or local currency to people in Latin America.
Yep.
People in certain parts of Latin America started telling us that they didn't trust their local banks. Sometimes they didn't have accounts in their local banks, and they needed still to get them money. And they suggested for us to distribute the funds via stablecoins. We started getting the request to disburse loans in stablecoins before anything else. It was, guys, love this new technology. I don't like my bank. I don't trust what these guys are going to do when the money hits. I want this sent to a different address. I want this sent to my own personal address in the form of stablecoins. And I now have found a way to sell these stablecoins into my local currency in the P2P market. And I would like to do that much more than going through my banks. I'm from Venezuela. I completely understand that request.
Yep.
I would not want assets hitting my bank accounts, not because I have anything to hide. I just don't want the government having more information on me. This is a government that is deliberately acting against people like me. So I don't want to arm them with more information about my financial transactions. So especially if I have the option not to, and do so in a legal way. So these people were doing what I would have done. And to me, it made absolute sense why they wanted this.
Yep.
If nobody in America has woken up one day and felt that the government was out to get them, or out to deliberately, close their businesses, or expropriate their assets like they did in Venezuela. Yep. It was a witch hunt. And so that's how the whole thing started. People wanted a stablecoin disbursement. We started disbursing stablecoins. The first one we worked with was actually DAI, because it was the most decentralized one, and we liked the team, the maker team. So we started dispersing DAIs to people. And then we started sourcing liquidity from our institutions to finance those loans in stablecoins, which we were very easily converting into dollars and dispersing. So we started basically seeing stablecoins on the periphery for loan disbursements, for settling with institutions, and then turning into dollars, for settling fast, for settling over the weekends.
Yep.
You couldn't settle cash over the weekends. You would settle stablecoins over the weekends. It was great.
Yep.
And this product just made an enormous amount of sense for me and for our clients. And so we first enabled disbursements in stablecoins, and they took off. Then people started saying, can I repay my loan back to you on stablecoins? And we said, sure, we'll take your money back as a repayment. Then people started saying, I no longer need a loan, but I would love to earn some yield on these stablecoins. Would you guys enable that? And after 5 or 6 requests, we all got together and said, is this any issue? We don't hold these stablecoins as Ledn. We get the stablecoins, we turn them into cash, we finance the loan, so we're not holding the stablecoin. There's no financial risk to Ledn to hold the stablecoins. So this doesn't really introduce new risks to the business that we cannot manage. So, and it adds a huge benefit to our clients worldwide. And so it started when we started dispersing loans in stables and cash. I believe the ratio was about 15% of the loan requests were disbursements in stablecoins. Today, that number is closer to 55 or 60. People want their funds dispersed on stablecoins. They trust them more. They feel like they have even more options to earn yield or pay things or do that with many times than their own fiat. And I think that a US dollar on a crypto rail is an immensely powerful tool if managed correctly.
Yeah.
So, and I see it as a bridge to Bitcoin.
Same here.
Because like I said, if you get into a digital dollar and you start seeing that this little bit of Bitcoin that you have, maybe you got paid with a bit of Bitcoin, you just let it sit there, and you start seeing that in dollar terms, your Bitcoin every time is worth more in dollar terms, more in dollar terms, more in dollar terms. And your dollars are earning interest. If you're at Ledn, you're keeping up with inflation. But let's just say you don't have your dollars at Ledn and you're seeing those dollars just sit there and the Bitcoin value will go up in dollar terms, go up in dollar terms. It's a matter of time before you say, okay, enough of this stuff. I'm going to park some more money here. And that's really the whole genesis. The way I understood Bitcoin, to me, it was a great protection from inflation, but it wasn't necessarily the best tool at the moment, or at least today, to issue payments, right?
Yeah.
Like if I buy a Bitcoin at $10, that Bitcoin goes to $200, then I want to buy a Coke that's cost $1, I'm paying like a 90-cent capital gain tax on that Coke.
That's right.
In addition to the sales tax.
Yep.
So it's not designed to do that. In fact, wealthy people don't sell their assets.
That's right.
They borrow against them. This is the whole point of Ledn. Going back to the point you made about Americans didn't get wealthy because they worked hard. They got wealthy because they bought that house somewhere in Kentucky for 25 grand, and now that house is worth 600 grand.
Right.
That's your generational wealth. Your generational wealth did not come from your little paycheck and your pension, right? And so that's a big misunderstanding too. And so so for me, when we were selling that Bitcoin and I saw how painful it was to sell that Bitcoin, and just it kept running up and you just didn't want to sell it.
Yeah.
It's the same way you want to sell your house. You want to take a loan against it to get the cash you need. Rent it out for the person to pay the monthly payments. Don't sell that thing. It's going up.
Yep.
Right? Why? Because the house isn't doing anything special, but every year the government runs out of money and they have to print a little more, and they print a little more, and they print a little more, and your house is like a flotation device. As they jack more water into the ocean, your lifeguard just floats right along with the water level.
That's right.
And your dollars don't do that. Your assets do.
Yep.
So Ledn is a tool to help people that have acquired that asset, in our view, the best asset, to hold on to it by planning accordingly and being able to access liquidity.
Yeah. Beautifully put. So to just very explicitly state exactly what you do for the audience, just in case people aren't familiar, you've given a sort of broad overview, but the general, I'll let you say it, but generally speaking, it's a way for people not to have to sell their Bitcoin and to take out a loan against it. Can you talk, can you just talk a little bit how easy it is, or actually, if you don't mind, 2 things. 1, the general overview, but 2, why you thought to make this make this your focus? You could have gone into Bitcoin mining. It sounds like you had somewhat of an understanding of it. Why Ledn? Why did that seem like the best product for you to create?
Yes. So why the product? So when we started out in the mining space, I learned how miners interplay with the Bitcoin network, how they get compensated, what it takes to have a successful mining operation. And coming out of that, my lessons were the following: to have a successful mining operation long term, you need to either have access to the cheapest chips, meaning you either make them yourselves, or access or be a utility,
Yeah.
or have access to the utility in a very, very close manner so you can negotiate absolutely outrageous costs of power.
Yeah.
Absent either one of those two things, you are just a hobby miner waiting to get squeezed. And I don't manufacture chips and I don't have a utility. So but I knew how a product that didn't exist yet could be articulated and be valuable to people. And my business partner had been financing renewable energy debt for 10 years. So he knows debt. And I know how to sell this to the Bitcoiner. So together, we had a unique set of skills that positioned us to be the lender that didn't exist. And so instead of doing something that we knew other people had experience at and perhaps deeper pockets and closer relationships, we decided to go on a path that had not been chartered, that had no real person doing it yet, and that needed to be built from the ground up. And that's effectively what we did. What Ledn does, to kind of tie the two questions, is we started out as a place that you could come with your Bitcoin to access a loan without having to sell it, and keep the upside of that Bitcoin, right? Conversely, if the value of Bitcoin goes down, you also need to top up. Like, I just want to be very clear that the product has benefits and also risks, and you need to plan accordingly to get the most out of it. But we take Bitcoin as collateral. We issue you $1 loan. When you repay us back the lower loan, you get back your Bitcoin. That's the process. And from there, we expanded to people that didn't need a loan or wanted to earn interest, passive income with their Bitcoin. And we had institutions on the other side asking us if we had any Bitcoin to lend for their market making activities. So we saw an opportunity there to create a new product, a yield offering for Bitcoin. So now people put Bitcoin at Ledn, deposit it to earn an interest. We then turn around, lend it to the institutions. We sit in the middle, take a spread between what they pay us and what we pay the client.
Got it.
The next from there was the USDC a yield product, which is going to be transitioning into the growth account. It's its new name. But this is a product where you deposit USDC into Ledn and you earn 9% is the rate right now. And the way we're able to pay 9% is because the people that borrow those dollars from us, placing Bitcoin as collateral, pay us 12.9. So the difference between what people pay us and what we pay is the spread, and that's how Ledn keeps the lights on. So it's a very simple business. And we also have a new product called the dual cryptocurrency note, which is a product that works in pairs, and it's just one more instrument for you to be able to get yield by pre-planning a future purchase or sale of Bitcoin at a future point in time at a price you would decide. So it's a very unique product, and it allows you to earn a great yield while you wait for your order to crystallize or not crystallize. So I can explain that in more detail, but in a nutshell, we have products that help you get the most out of your Bitcoin, whether it's whether as collateral for a loan or as an instrument to earn passive income. And we do the same for dollars. And what sets us apart in many ways is our obsession with transparency and accountability. We were the first lender to do proof of reserve statements. We do them every 6 months at stations, and they are verifiable by our clients. We produce what's called the open book report, which gets produced once a month, and people can see how we use the assets to pay the interest rates that we do. And that's a myriad of other upgrades, like the growth account, which now provides ring fencing legally and technically from institutional loans issued out of the yield product, so that it's ring fenced from all of the other products that we offer. So we've been doing continual improvement to the offering, so that we ensure that we're going to, we're in the lead right now in terms of this industry, just based on recent events. And we have we feel a deep responsibility to build this into the image of the industry that we would like to see, and not repeat the same mistakes that some of these maybe shorter term thinkers before us made.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming you're referring to maybe the Celsiuses or some of the BlockFis of the world. And I'm not saying you're casting shade on them, but there were a lot of decisions that these organizations made that might have, what you're saying is that you're making decisions that are a lot, I guess, safer would be the simplest word to use. You're, it's not that, I don't know how to put it. There were different, with those other institutions, yield was being generated in different ways. Some of those ways were not as safe / legitimate. Some were, I mean, with something like Celsius, there's yield farming going on, and there's a lot of experimentation with very new protocols, smart contracts that could be hacked very easily. With you guys, it seems that is not the case. And honestly, I was cheering for you as all that was happening because I followed you for a while. The Venezuela connection, I was always like, I want this guy to succeed. I really do it. And then when everything started blowing up, I was like, please not let him. Please don't let this happen. And I was truly, honestly, I mean, genuinely impressed with the fact that you guys had it so together that it didn't impact you. And I think it takes a lot of due diligence. It takes a lot of, just doing your homework to make sure you're not putting customers' funds in jeopardy. And so, props to you for that. It's a notable achievement given everything that's happened. And I think you kept in mind the one thing that every investor needs to keep in mind, which is just risk management. If money goes up, that's good. That's the icing on the cake. It's just don't lose it. Figure out a way not to lose it. That's really the important part, which is amazing. And I think also it's a great service in that, it does holding your Bitcoin. You're setting a base for the floor as this monetization process. So encouraging people not necessarily to sell it, to hold on to it, to use some whatever fiat for the time being that they can borrow from you, I think does a service to the price of Bitcoin in the grand scheme of things. The only thing I do for listeners, I write a lot. I have my own newsletter and stuff. The golden rule of Bitcoin, as many know, is not your keys, not your coins. So if you are engaging with something like Ledn, it's not necessarily technically you are giving over your coins for a period of time in exchange for a loan. So it's just important. I'm just putting it out there for the listeners to, put out there. I actually do. I feel like I'm bringing up this guy too much, but Peter McCormack talked about some of these products and saying, I actually trust my money with people versus in a smart contract. I have mixed feelings. Obviously, it depends on how well audited the smart contract is. But for the most part, I think a large part of what you do is based on reputation. You've been successful for 5 years now. You take your job very seriously, and yeah, you've done a great job. You survived all these other blowups, and yeah, it's more no real question after that. I just commend you for being honest and taking people's hard-earned money into consideration. I'm wondering, honestly, I think about it, and I think a lot of Bitcoiners are pretty adversarial thinkers. We're constantly looking at what could go wrong. Is that something you have to deal with on a psychological and an emotional level? Are you constantly sort of looking at what you might be missing? Is that an issue or not so much?
So naturally, as you said, Bitcoiners are very conscious or aware of risks. So Bitcoiners are very astute diligencers.
Yes.
And so because we've kind of focused on what I think is the hardest trust to earn, right? Like we're going out trying to earn the trust of the most skeptical group of people on planet Earth.
Yeah.
In my view. And somebody asked me this a couple of weeks ago, which is, what do you think about earning trust? Like, how do you earn somebody's trust? And that's effectively what we had to do from day one. Like we weren't brand names or household names. Adam and I didn't go to Harvard or Stanford.
Right.
Neither did our parents. We come from what you would call hardworking families, one in Venezuela, one in Canada. And so we had to get people to trust us. So the question is, how do you do that? Well, you make yourself as transparent and as verifiable as the asset that they are using. If we say to you, this is our custodian, that's our custodian. We had guys that wanted to get on the phone with BitGo, make sure that we were telling them the truth. And then they did. And lo and behold, BitGo said yes. And so it's really about being honest,
Yeah.
because when people diligence you, if you say, hey, this is what I do, this is how I make the interest, and somebody wants to go one layer deep and contact that group or contact somebody that you say is related, and that person says, yes, this is exactly how it works, that builds a little bit of trust.
Yeah.
When you say, hey, by X date, I'm going to have this feature available, and on that day, you call them and you say, hey, remember when I told you this feature was going to be available today? It's today, and it's available.
Yeah.
That builds a little bit of trust. When I tell you, if somebody says, hey, guys, I love you guys, I love the concept, I want to wait for 6 more months just to make sure you guys are real. You call that person back after 6 months and you say, hey, remember that chat? We're still here. Whenever you're ready, we'll come to you. That builds a little bit of trust. And so you just keep doing, dotting your I's, crossing your T's, showing up. Once somebody has a good experience, they'll go and tell their friend.
Yeah.
We never had a big marketing budget. We did most of our growth before or as we were raising the VC funding. We didn't even have enough time to spend the VC funding, So what ended up happening is when you do right by your clients, a small number of them as it may be, and the market comes back, those people that never left the market, they become the reference points to everyone coming in. And when that person says, hey, I heard that you can borrow against your Bitcoin instead of selling it, I may want to do that to borrow more Bitcoin. Where should I go? And they'll say, I had a great experience with these guys at Ledn. You should check them out.
Yeah.
That's where most of Ledn's growth comes from.
Okay.
And if you read our reviews, which I love our clients. I still don't know how they find the creativity to do the things they do. But if you read our reviews, they are a testament to our work.
Yep.
People say things like, these guys did what they said they would. Some people said, I've had loans liquidated and during the bear markets when prices drop aggressively and I didn't have enough Bitcoin to cover it. And I had loans in all of the different platforms and all of them were impacted. And if I could redo all of my loans again, and when I redo all of my loans again, I'm going to do it at Ledn.
Yep.
Because the process was the absolute best with them.
Yep.
And so in the good times, in the bad times, if you have good news to deliver, if you have bad news to deliver, do the right thing.
Yep.
Right? Like in another saying we have at Ledn is there's what you can do and there's what you should do. Do what you should do.
Yeah.
When you do what you can do, you can get down a slippery slope very, very fast.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Beautifully put. I appreciate it. To end on a maybe hopefully an optimistic note, Bitcoin in Venezuela, maybe 5-10 years from now, let's say it's a little bit less volatile. Maybe there's more education. It's a very interesting variable, Bitcoin, because it can help people on the individual level, but it doesn't do away with, the debts outstanding, the IMF, the World Bank, the things have to be dealt with at a country level, at a governmental level. What do you see? What role does Bitcoin play there? Now I know you live in Canada, if that wasn't clear to the audience, but I'm sure that to some degree your heart is partially in Venezuela. I would imagine to some degree for sure. What does it look like realistically, do you think? So as Bitcoin grows, becomes more adopted, how does it help people in your mind and your imagination?
Yes, that's a great question. And to answer the first part of your question, a small part of my heart is here. The rest of it is in Venezuela.
Yeah, okay. Yep, beautiful.
This is how I think this plays out. And again, this is my very personal view.
Yep.
It's easy for people in North America to discard Bitcoin as just one more asset in your portfolio. Because if you look at the things that you can purchase, you can buy bonds, you can buy stock, you can buy real estate, you can buy foreign stock, foreign bonds, like foreign currency. You have the largest menu of financial instruments of any living human. That holds true maybe in parts of Europe. And that holds true maybe in Canada, maybe in Japan, maybe in Australia. Doesn't come out of the G7. Even the people in China don't have access to this.
Yep.
The role I think Bitcoin plays as a permissionless and unstoppable asset, reserve asset, is that gradually it'll probably track US equities a little bit more.
Yep.
From there, it'll go from tracking gold a little bit better. And that might seem like a simple tool for most people.
Yeah.
But to tell somebody in Venezuela or in Mexico or in Argentina or in Uruguay or in Brazil that they can own a piece of an instrument that moves like the S&P, that has the wealth creation potential of the S&P 500 and the inflation protection potential of the S&P 500, and that they can now buy that without asking anyone's permission with their local currency,
Yep.
and park it in an account in a place like Ledn, where they can use it to get a loan, where they can use it to earn passive income, when they can send it and move it around to anyone in the world and make any payment they want, it is going to eat more and more of the asset portfolio base of Latin America.
Yep.
And it's going to be used as an investment instrument first before it is used as money. And in Venezuela, when you get a windfall payment, if in the past you bought 50% of it in dollars and 50% of it in local real estate, now you're going to buy 50% of that in Bitcoin, some 50% of it in dollars. And that delta is going to go from the fact that you're not buying that local property anymore. This does two things. One, it gives you the hedge of not being exposed to that local asset. And the second one is that it removes power from the government to then, because it puts the inflation back into their pocket. It's like, oh, here, I'm printing money to finance my debt. And they say, thanks, no worries. Here's your money back. It's no use to me. I don't believe in it. And then their inflation is they're going to have a much harder time managing inflation, which is going to put much more pressure for true democracy to come back. So I see Bitcoin as both a financial tool that people can use for the portfolios that today many times don't exist. It's an option for them to start building those portfolios. And it's also an option to add pressure to corrupt and inefficient governments to bring back democracy when they have forcefully taken it away.
And beautifully put. And just to clarify, just to make sure that I'm on the same page as you, and also for the audience, I think what you're getting at is that when you do have sort of a centralized control of the money supply and everybody relies on that, it's very difficult to argue that you actually have democracy, because you have this kind of centralized force, filled with people who might be appointed by elected individuals, but for the most part are unelected bureaucrats making decisions that are somewhat constrained, somewhat not constrained. This alters the reality of what's actually happening in a democracy, because in reality, what we should have is people saying, look, you're going to vote for the amount of taxes you pay. I'm a candidate, this is what you can do. But if you're debasing the currency, plus you have the tax factor, it's two different things. And it does actually take away from the people's say in what's going on in their world, which is democracy. So I don't know if that's what you were getting at. I just wanted to clarify.
I think it's well said. I think the way I was framing it is, in Venezuela, Chavez, or the Chavista government, prints away into infinity. They've created hyperinflation.
Right.
But yet, when was the last fair election in Venezuela?
Oh yeah.
There was no fair election, and if the country is sunk in a sea of unmanageable hyperinflation, it's going to be impossible to hide the democratic discontent.
Sure.
Right? Like in Venezuela, they still get by it because they have the guns. The last few elections in Venezuela have not been fair. I'll stand by that all day long.
Yeah.
But they haven't been fair because, again, there's just enough people. Inflation is just bad enough for people to manage, and when it's getting really bad, they print surgically to help the right for people to quiet those focus points in society and prevent that from expanding. But when everything they do leads to more hyperinflation and more hyperinflation and more hyperinflation, the people are just going to look around and say, you're the problem.
Right.
And so that's what I mean by taking power away from them, by opting out of their currency.
Yeah.
They rely on you keeping it and not passing it like a hot potato so that inflation doesn't skyrocket.
Yep.
And the only reason you take the hot potato is because many times you try to pass it and no one will take it. And once you have the ability to own Bitcoin, you're going to find a way to dump that potato.
Yes.
Like one way or another. There will be no universe in which you keep it. 100%. And so I think that has that dual impact of helping you build a portfolio and adding for more incentives towards democracy.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly put. I actually just wrote something the other day where I had 2 points. One was the corporation, one was the state, and people were sort of, especially non-landowners, were sort of trapped in between these two things. And all I think Bitcoin does, and I think this is what you're getting at there, is it turns it into 3 points. One is the state, one is the corporation, then one is the human being with Bitcoin. So you have a sort of new axis of power. It doesn't end the corporation or the state. It doesn't turn the world into Mad Max, whatever. It shifts some of the power back to people on the most local level.
And it makes them have to lure you back with good incentives.
That's right. Yes.
To interact with them.
Yes.
Right. No longer can they rely on the fact that you have to interact with them because you're in your little imaginary zone that you drew up with a line and a map, and you control your imaginary piece of paper. It's not going to work enough anymore.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it on that note. Mauricio, it was really, my gut told me, like, reach out to this guy, talk to him. Thank you so much for doing this. I very, very much appreciated this. I think hopefully the audience will learn a lot of lessons from this, maybe expand their mind. If you're listening in like US, Canada, some of these countries you mentioned, that, there's things happening with money, finances, markets, outside of these countries that are, it's intense what goes on. Having seen it with my own two eyes in Venezuela, it's quite heartbreaking. In the long term, I do hope that Bitcoin is a bit of a life raft for the time being, whether it's dollars or whatever instrument people use. I hope they're getting what they need. But yeah, and with Ledn, congratulations again on 5 successful years. May you have another 50. Thank you for being an honest, clear, rational thinking voice in the Bitcoin space, in the broader finance space, and even for taking the position you did with stablecoins because you thought it was the right thing to do. I admire all of it. As someone who is sort of solutions oriented, I look up to you. I appreciate what you're doing, and thank you for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, Frank. That means a lot. I hope we can do this again soon.
Cool. Thank you.